Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In this video, we're going to be talking about the concept of contained databases. So let's begin. What is a contained database? A contained database, as the name implies, is a self-contained database that has its own database settings, configurations, and metadata, and does not depend on the SQL instance that it's on. And there's a great advantage in having that, and I'll be showing you that in a second. And what I mean by self-contained is, imagine when I create a database on an instance, the database configuration, its metadata relies on and is on the master database. In a self-contained database, all that metadata about its configuration is actually within the database itself. So that's the primary difference between a regular database that depends on the SQL instance and a self-contained database that has metadata and configuration settings within itself. So what are some of the advantages when you create a contained database? So having this feature allows us to bypass having an SQL login to access the database. As you know, in order to access any database, you have to have a SQL login created. This is one of the steps that you can bypass because there's no need for an SQL login. All the security features are within the SQL user that accesses the database, and that's another great benefit that it has. That permits the databases to be moved to another server without creating issues and orphaned SQL logins. And I'll be demonstrating that to you in a second. This is a great advantage that DBAs have. And one of the issues that we used to have is that when you moved a database from source A to destination B, we could move the database, but all the associated logins of the original database had to be recreated in the destination. And if you'd missed some of these logins, then you could have security issues and you have to recreate them. So that could be a little hassle here. But in a self-contained database, actually there are no SQL logins, just SQL users. So that's a great thing. And then the SQL users move along with the moved database. There are two types of contained databases: a fully contained database that has no configuration dependencies on the instance. Now this one, a fully contained, actually is in 2016 version. I'm using a 2014 version. So right now you'll see what's called a partially contained database. And it's easier to separate the data from the instance. So I'll show you that in a second. So just realize that we do not have, in this instance, what's called a fully contained database, only a partially contained database. And by reducing the ties to the instance of the SQL, partially contained database can be useful during a failover when you have what's called always-on availability groups. And I'll be demonstrating that to you in the next course, actually, when we talk about availability groups. But right now, it's important to understand that when you migrate a database from one source to another, those logins and users must transfer also. And having a contained database, you can circumvent that to some degree. So let's talk about that when we talk about the third course. A couple of things that partially contained databases cannot do, and that is they cannot use replication and change data capture. So again, these are a few things that are a disadvantage in having a partially contained database. I'm going to be showing you how to actually create a contained database using both this T-SQL and the GUI, like I always do. And one thing to note is that by default, a SQL contained database is disabled. You have to actually enable it using a sprock called sbconfigure, and then I'll show you that in a second. And these are the couple of terminologies that you can use. A non-contained database will have the setting of none. So just take a note of that, and I'll show you that in a second. So just to reiterate, what is a contained database? A contained database, as the name implies, is a self-contained database that has its own configurations and settings within it, so it makes it much easier for migrating the data from source to destination. Whereas a regular database that is dependent on the SQL instance, when you migrate it from source to destination, then you can have issues with orphan SQL logins, and I'll be demonstrating that to you in a second. So let's move to our SQL server. And what I want you to notice right now here is I've got two instances here. One is the H4U instance, and one is the H4U/dev. So what I want you to look at now is here. I'm going to refresh the databases. and I do not see a database called prod. If I go to security and go to login and refresh that, I do not see a login called Andy. So take a note of that. So the following demonstration will show that a regular database, which has both the SQL user and SQL logins, do not migrate to another instance of a database, but rather become SQL login orphans. But a contained database, when moved, retains the SQL user information so as to prevent users. So this can be obviously a tremendous help to the DBA when he doesn't have to worry about what's called SQL login orphans. And when I demonstrate that to you right now, you'll get a better understanding. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to be creating a normal database. Then I'm going to create a normal login called Andy. And then I'm going to create a normal user called Andy. And then I'm going to add him to the database role. Now, this is the way you would normally control and create a database. This is not a contained database. So let's highlight this and go execute. And now if I go to the database and refresh, you'll see that I have a database right here called prod. If I expand that and go to security and users, you'll see I have a user called Andy. If I scroll down to securities for logins, if I highlight that, you'll see I have a login called Andy. So now that stage is set for transferring this prod database. So the next thing I'm going to do actually is I'm going to take this prod database and I'm going to actually back up and restore it on a different instance or a different server. And this is what it's going to be called dev. And what I want you to notice is that when I do the migration or movement of database from prod from source to destination, we do not get SQL login here. We did see this SQL login. We will not see it in the thing, and that's called an SQL orphan. So that can be problematic. But when I create a database, a contained database here, and then I restore it and back it here, you'll see that you'll see that the user Andy actually did move. So that's the great advantages. So that's the whole idea of this next video. So I've created the database and I've shown you the login user. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually back up that database. Let me get rid of this old one so you can see it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I'm going to back up this database on this instance. So I'm backing up the database and I'll provide you for all this script. And I'm going to go execute. And now if I go to that folder, you'll see that prod backup has been created. So now that we've got a backup of this prod on this server, what I want to do now is I want to restore this prod database to this instance, to this separate server. So if I expand databases, refresh it, you'll see that I do not have prod database on this instance, and I'm going to restore it here. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to copy this. This is the restore command that I'll provide for you. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go to the dev and go new query so I can connect to this database. So if I hover over here, you'll see the word dev there, right there. And I'm going to paste this here and I'm going to execute. And now that database prod has been restored here. So let's go to databases, refresh, and there it is. And one other thing I want you to notice is if I expand this, if I expand the security, if I expand the users, you'll see Andy. If I go down here to securities, if I go to login, if I go to refresh, I do not see Andy. And that's the point, because now we've got an orphaned SQL login. We saw that here when I went to securities in the original, in the source. You see this login called Andy. When I migrated the data or restored or backed up and restored data to a different instance from here to here, I did not capture this SQL login. And now it's actually created a security issue because I don't know how many logins are out there that could be problematic. So that's what happens. That's the disadvantage of creating a regular database. So let's continue. So let's go back here. So now I can see if I've got any of those orphans by this. So find SQL orphans. Run these scripts against the dev database to find orphans. Change connections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, copy. I'm going to go back to that instance, which is the connection to dev. I'm going to paste it here, and I'm going to just run it. So it's use prod, and this is a Sprock SP change users login report. So it's giving me a report of all the orphans. So if I execute it, we should see Andy, and we do. So if I go back here, and now obviously once you found orphans, we need to change their passwords because this particular password came in with the original one. So what we need to do is go here, and again I'll be providing you with this. So this is another Sprock SP change users login. It's going to auto fix Andy, and it's going to give the new word password. So I'm going to copy this, go to this instance, paste it, and when I run it now, it's actually going to take that orphan and change the password. And when I execute it, and now if I run the report, I should not see Andy because now he's no longer an orphaned SQL login. Now, so the whole idea was that we didn't create an SQL login for Andy, and can he now actually log on to the database without an SQL login? So let's try that. So go here,